Welcome back, listeners. It's my very great pleasure today. It's a real coup to welcome Captain Wayne Kearns, retired, former Deputy Chief Pilot of Qantas Airways.
Correct.
And AIPA President.
Correct.
Welcome, Wayne. This is incredibly exciting. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
How are you, Wayne?
I'm very good, thank you. Very good.
How's retirement treating you?
Very busy. I've been retired since 2008. So what's that?
Really?
17 years.
Holy smokes, really?
Yeah.
I will start this conversation off by saying that I never had the pleasure of Mahogany Row, of Captain Kearns' office, bringing my own Ice Vivos or Lamingtons or Tim Tams at the time. So I never had that pleasure. So this is actually the first time I've had the chat with Captain Kearns. So I'm looking forward to this one. I'm a lot more relaxed than I would have been in my heyday when Wayne had a lot of power in Qantas.
Yeah, well, no one ever got biscuits.
Did you get any biscuits?
No.
They didn't bring them for you either?
They abolished tea ladies by then.
So it was just a comfortable chat amongst friends?
Just a chat. And my aim was that once we had the chat, the matter was closed.
Yeah. So I'm sure Flight Ops management's very different to what it was in your days. But so there's a couple of things I'd like to talk about. Well, there's hundreds of things I'd like to talk about. But can we go back to 1981? So as a former president of AIPA, which is your name's very proudly on our past presidents and life members boards in our AIPA office. So we're very proud to have you with us today and have your involvement. Is it true that AIPA came out of a dispute on the SP with the flight attendants or the stewards?
No, that was part of it. What had been going on for a couple of years. In those days, we were the overseas branch of the AFAP, and we were based in Sydney, and the New South Wales branch, which was basically Airlines in New South Wales and East West, were also based in Sydney. We had an office at 66 Chandos Street, St Leonard's.
Yep.
And they'd go down every month to the meetings down in Melbourne, and the meetings would be dominated by the voting structure, by all the people who were employed by ANZAC, because it was based on a state, and ANZAC had a branch in every state.
Oh, I see.
And TA had, they were in Brisbane, and they were in Sydney, and they were in Melbourne as well. And they talk about all sorts of things like wearing ties in summer in Queensland. A lot of time was spent on GA stuff. But it all boiled over head office interference in overseas branch affairs, and there were a few of those. There was a captain who had a few alcohol-related incidents. It wasn't about alcohol in aeroplanes; it was about misbehaviour on the ground.
Yep.
And basically, the Qantas pilots knew what he was like, and when Qantas was going to do something with him, the Qantas pilots wouldn't support him. But the AFAP wanted us to go on strike. That was one example.
Was it?
There was a thing called a route protection policy, where it was agreed that domestic airlines did domestic, but international did international. And ANZAC's ambition, they wanted to go to Singapore, and also they did one from Christchurch to Hobart. And then the one you mentioned was the SP dispute. At the time, the cabin crew, there were two cabin crew unions, the boys' union and the girls' union.
Yep.
And the boys' union had changed executive. And the new executive that came in were quite belligerent towards Qantas, and they decided to take Qantas on, and they basically wouldn't agree to anything. And the SPs were coming in, and they basically came in for two reasons. One was to compete with Pan Am to go to Los Angeles. The other one was to put a Qantas presence back into Wellington. Anyway, the boys' union put a ban on the SPs, and so Qantas decided to fly them without the boys crewing them.
Yep.
And the president of AIPA at that time, a guy called Jeff Westwood, he was keen to show that AIPA were strong and independent.
Well, what were we, the overseas branch or something? We weren't even AIPA then, were we?
No, we'd broken away by that stage.
Oh, okay.
We hadn't broke away, right?
So the overseas branch of the AFAP.
It showed that we were strong and independent, right?
Yep.
And so he indicated to Qantas that we would allow volunteer pilots to crew the doors. not to serve the meals, but to crew the doors. So on the first SP services, a combination of technical crew and female flight attendants crewed the doors.
How did they find volunteers to come and crew?
There were plenty of volunteers.
What was that at the front bar at the Green Gate or the?
No, might have been, but no, they were out there. There was quite a bit of antagonism between pilots and the boys' union, because the cabin crew boys' union were doing all sorts of stupid things, like they were banning serving hot towels, and they were to passengers. They wouldn't allow people to bring duty free on the aeroplane. When we started the LA services, they reckoned everyone was going to die, so they had all the boys lining up peeing in milk bottles in LA to show that they were fatigued when they arrived there. Whereas our approach was, hey, we'll do it. Just give us the money.
It's coming. It's
coming. Right?
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of pilots that were supportive of Qantas in their initiative. But the AFAP hierarchy were very condemning of the Qantas pilot group. So eventually it boiled over enough where we had a lot of general meetings, and there were enough people voted to break away.
And was that a real coup, like that happened in the middle of the night type thing, where or that it had been, as you said, brewing for a fair while?
It had been brewing when Dick Holt was the president of the AFAP. He was experienced and smart enough to be able to put a lid on it.
Yep.
But once he sort of got out of the picture and went into the background, the new guys that came along were the sort of people that put fires out with petrol.
Yep.
And whatever they did just inflamed it. And then eventually it was time to go.
And of course, those listeners and viewers may not know who Dick Holt was. Dick was Captain Robin Holt, retired, Captain David Holt, yes. And Second Officer Will Holt's father and grandfather, wasn't he?
He had about, I think it was 9 kids.
10?
10, was it?
Yep.
Yeah, about 10.
8 boys and 2 girls.
Yeah, a couple of them were prominent in the Brisbane medical scene.
Yep, absolutely.
And but he was a big figure in the 70s in the AFAP.
Yeah. And so Dick had been managed to keep the overseas branch and the domestic guys under one big happy family.
Yeah. Well, keep a lid on it.
Somewhat, yeah. So then 1981, AIPA was born.
Yeah, we broke away, yes.
And was that on the back of an envelope and a few manila folders?
No. It's a funny story about that.
Of course there would be, that's why.
Westwood lived down in Caringbah.
Okay.
And over his back fence was a judge of the New South Wales Industrial Court, a guy called Jim Mackin.
Oh, because I've read the history you suggested I read, so now this is putting some detail to the history, okay.
So Westwood and Jim Mackin used to talk over the fence. And Jim Mackin's brother was Tony Mackin, a Melbourne-based barrister, who was pretty skilled in industrial law. So they came up with the way that we could break away was to form a New South Wales registered trade union.
Yep.
Break away into the registered trade union. And go from there. Now, to do that, you had to get the union registered, was the first one. And the second one, there were a lot of people that weren't sort of really industrially involved, were worried about the loss of licence insurance.
So is that the MBF we're still talking about now, Wayne?
Well, what was the MBF?
Yes.
Yeah. And in there, you contributed your loss of licence money to the MBF. But once we left, the fear was once we left the AFAP, we wouldn't have that loss of licence coverage. And we'd already had one failed attempt at insuring loss of licence overseas.
Yep.
And it wasn't very successful because a lot of people had a lot of exclusions. And so Westwood, to his credit, he had a very good relationship with the then Qantas Chief Executive, Keith Hamilton. And so we got an agreement with Keith Hamilton to underwrite a new loss of licence scheme for the Qantas Pilot Group.
Yep.
And also to agree to a common law contract for our industrial coverage. And Keith Hamilton agreed to both of those. So both those log jams were cleared.
Were they?
And so we broke away. Everyone signed up, well, nearly everyone signed up to the New South Wales registered union. Tony Mackin in Melbourne did all the court work and the industrial work. A new loss of licence scheme was opened called the Voluntary and Contributory Scheme, which was a mirror image of the AFAP MBF. And we had an insurance company in Sydney do the underwriting on that insurance.
So the AFAP probably liked us even less because we were New South Wales registered and they were good Victorian trade unions.
Well, they fought us in the court.
Did they?
I mean, one of the ironies of it is the AFAP's industrial legal representation was a guy called Dr. Chris Jessup, who is now a federal court judge, and he led the AFAP's fight against AIPA to break away.
Did he?
When we did the legal work for the integration agreement in 1993, at that stage I was at Qantas, and we retained Dr. Chris Jessup to be our representative.
I will get to the integration agreement, but I'm interested just in this little 80s period. We quite often get now, even 45 years later, AIPA's too close to the company. I know where that statement comes from. Do you remember? Well, Rick Fitzsimon's father was the president of the AIPA.
Well, I didn't want to use that name, but seeing you...
No, Rick's happy to talk about it.
Well,
absolutely.
In my opinion, and I've got the documents to show it and back it up, a nice bloke across the table, right? He was one of the guys running around with buckets of petrol.
Yeah, he was telling everyone that we were too close to the company.
That's right.
And now they're still using it against us 45 years later. So,
well, that's right. And I mean, it's the argument that union AIPA people are too close to the company is, in my opinion, is just rubbish, because you've got to have a good working relationship where the AIPA representatives and the company representatives respect each other.
Yeah.
Part of that is because the people at AIPA have decided that the Qantas management was the enemy. And whilst they were all the people that held all the tools and the money and the gold, as I used to call
Absolutely.
it, if you got on with them and they understood what you were trying to get at, they, in my opinion, they weren't the enemy.
I just want to go back very briefly before we go forward. So as a new pilot in Qantas in the 70s, flying with all those World War II blokes, and they were blokes, there was no women in Qantas until 84. That must have been one, interesting, and two, incredibly difficult and challenging. Those guys had a fair bit of past history with aeroplanes, didn't they?
Yes, but there was a handful of tyrants.
Yep.
But you knew who they were and what they did and how they tried to exert their authority. But most of them were just genuinely lovely guys.
Were they?
I mean, one of my interesting things I used to do, I used to record the Sydney Anzac Day March, then watch it on replay and look at how many people I could recognise.
And these are blokes you'd flown with?
They were returned
servicemen.
But unfortunately, they've all gone.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, you are the keeper of history as well, aren't you? This is one of your retirement passions, I guess.
Well, it is. It's I didn't throw very much stuff out, especially in the last 30 years, because I've always believed it would come in handy somewhere to keep the record straight. And it does. It gets used lots and lots of times.
All the time.
So, and it's interesting to go back into too.
So how did Jeff Westwood, our first president, and then how did you end up becoming president? Was that a tap on the shoulder or you were very ambitious to be king? Or?
No, quite the opposite. No, what happened was a group of, you referred to it earlier, but a group of us who were very young second officers in our 20s used to go to the Greengate Hotel in Killara.
Absolutely.
And after about 8 years after stagnation, we decided that if our paying conditions were ever going to get fixed, it was up for people like us to fix it.
Yep.
So we decided that the overseas branch was actually the problem. It wasn't Qantas. What would happen, we'd put all our ambitions in our log of claims. And when they got to the negotiating table, they said, we've got to cut the log of claims down so all the second officer things can go.
And that's because it was a captain's union or
captains and FOs. And there were a few SOs on the thing, but they sort of not much sort of got achieved for second officers.
And flight engineers and navigators?
Oh, they weren't in our union.
Okay.
But the second officers at that stage, we were way behind the eight ball on many, many points. And
you held a type rating, a panel rating, a radio operator's license, all these things. You weren't just a cruise pilot, were you?
No, that's true. But we used to get our loss of license was inferior. We used to do training days where you didn't get paid. Our pay rates. There were people who were ex Royal Air Force who got a personal differential of about $9,000 in 1970 terms, more than someone that had come in from GA.
Did they?
Who were on much lower hourly rates. Yep. And so we thought we needed to do something about it. So we decided to take Jeff Westwood on, who was the chairman of the overseas branch. And to his credit and wisdom, he solved 2 or 3 of the major ones, right? But after that was all over, he rang me up and he said, now Motormouth, get in and put your money where your mouth is. So I joined I wasn't interested in being on the committee, joined the committee. And as soon as I was there, he gave me a job and I was in charge of accommodation allowances for about 3 years. And then Jeff got rolled by Barry Roberts in a coup. And anyway, that year was a year in the wilderness, which is a subject of its own. And then Jeff came back that was at the end of 1983, and he asked me to come back as his vice president. And so I came back as his vice president at the end of 83. Basically, I got the job of doing most of the industrial negotiations and things like that at the time, and there was a lot going on. And then I was prevailed upon by people in the executive who said, it's time for Jeff to go.
Yep.
And I said, well, I'm not interested. And they said, well, he's got to go. And if it's not you, it's someone, you're the only one that can do it. And I said, well, I'm not going to do the numbers and counting. If someone wants to come and show me the majority of the committee don't want Jeff, I'll think about it.
Yep.
Anyway, they came back. There was 40 on the committee, and they said, we got 38. We know Jeff's not going to vote that way. And the other guy keeps changing his mind. So anyway, we went and the other vice president, John Jensen, and I went and had a meeting with Jeff up at the Intercontinental Hotel. I always remember it, walk in. I was nervous as a cat on a tin roof, right? And Jeff's there and he says, okay, when do you want to take over? And I said, well, why don't you say you decided to retire? And then once you do that, I'll take over then. He said, good, settled. Let's go and have lunch.
So you remain friends with Jeff?
Oh, yes. Yep. Yes, always remain friends with Jeff. There was never any bad feeling over the thing. So anyway, I was president for 3 years and I'd avoided kept us out of the 89 domestic pilots dispute. In the meantime, we'd negotiated a good pay rise for the 400. We were the only airline in the world that got a pay rise for the 400. Mm-hmm. And I decided it was time to go.
And did you keep us out of the 89 dispute by good luck or management or combination of all of that?
No. I'm a student of history and I followed what goes on.
Yep.
And all through the 80s, I noticed or watched the airlines in the States taking on the management and losing big time. Continental, Eastern, Pan Am,
goes on and on
Northwest,
and on,
United, and then in Europe it was the same, right? And by the middle, an important part was by the middle of the 1980s, Buck Brooksbank became president of the AFAP,
yep.
And he wanted to get us back together. And he invited me to go along to the AFALPA conferences, but only as long as I understood I was persona non grata there.
To be seen and not heard type thing.
Yeah. And I was happy to do that. But what that gave me a chance to do was in the bars was to talk to all the other pilots from the other unions around the world about their industrial tactics, their ambitions for the 400 and all that sort of stuff, right? And in that same era, Ronald Reagan had sacked all the civil air traffic controllers in the US.
Yep.
And here in New South Wales, Devil Rand had isolated the coal miners. He'd isolated the tanker drivers and the people who worked at the oil refinery at Kurnell. Yep. So I thought that there was, with the Labor government backed by the ACTU, there was no way in the world
we're ever going to win that, were we?
The win was never going to take place. But the AFAP decided that they were going to take them on.
Did you talk to McCarthy and Co?
Yes.
They picked up the phone and they said, Wayne, what do you think? Or...
Oh, no. Well, more than that.
Oh, did they?
We talked about it, and it was I think it was April. And I'm not a big AFL fan, but there's a famous day in Melbourne in April where I think it's Hawthorn and Essendon play a big match. And it was, in those days, they had Waverley Park.
Yep.
And anyway, they invited me down to go as their guest.
Wined and dined by the AFAP.
Wined and dined by the AFAP. Wow. And in those days, to get to Melbourne, staff travel, there was a 747 went down early in the morning.
Was there?
And I think it left Sydney at 7:30 or something. So I got that. The TA Vice President, Noel Holt, picked me up at the airport. He took me out to his place where other people met me. Then we were in this minibus that went all around Melbourne picking up various members of the AFAP executive, and they picked up a TA management pilot as well. So anyway, we eventually get to the VIP, one of the VIP rooms at VFL Park.
Did they have VB on tap?
Yes, it is Victoria.
Okay. So it was, that wasn't bad. Too bad then.
Yeah, Victoria. Anyway, so when I get there, there's the Ansett AFAP executive people. There was the AFP executive. There was the executive director of the AFAP, Len Korsch, was there. And I thought, this is everyone who's who in the aviation industrial scene in Melbourne.
This has come to watch the footy with me.
He watched the football. And anyway, they talked. Brian McCarthy was there. He'd just become president.
Yep.
And he was the only one that supported Hawthorn. The rest were all Essendon people. So anyway, we went to the football. The football was over. We had lots of beers there. The bus did the return trip, and we ended up at a guy. His nickname was Bluey, but he was the TAA scheduling rep, and it was his birthday. So we went to his place for the party. Anyway, by this stage, it's 10 o'clock at night or something.
Getting a bit tired and emotional.
Oh, well.
Been up early to come down to Melbourne.
Have a bit of stammer in those days. Yeah. So anyway, they corralled me in the kitchen and said, okay, we're here. You're not here to be nice, for us to be nice to you. You're here because we want your support for our oncoming dispute. And I said, we're not going to give you any support.
Was this the first time they'd asked, or they'd asked before?
That was the first time
they flew you down to Melbourne to ask for that?
There were lots of hints, but that was the first time that they'd asked. And I said, we won't break your strike, right? But we are not going to get involved in. We don't think you'll win, right? And so wish you the best of luck.
Did we have AIPA members that were keen to get involved? Were people saying to Conway, we've got to get on this?
There were a few. There was what I call as a rump. And there were those that generally thought that the AFA were going to win. And then there's a whole silent group there that believe in the brotherhood of pilots. And then if they do something, we've got to support them.
Yeah.
But if you take that to the next step, if they lose their jobs, we've got to lose our jobs too.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
We're not in that sort of stuff.
You weren't prepared to go down that path.
Yeah. So anyway, but we went back to I stayed at the TA Vice President's place overnight, and he delivered me back to the airport the next day to come home.
And that was it?
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting guys that was there was a guy called John Raby.
Oh.
Now, he was the Ansett Vice President.
Yeah.
And after the dispute, Raby went up, and as I understand it, he was running the...
was he Compass, or he ended up somewhere, didn't he?
He helped
Virgin.
Brett Godfrey set up Virgin.
Okay, yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd heard I could remember his name somewhere, but I could.
He's still in Queensland, but he helped Brett Godfrey set up Virgin.
Okay.
So
then moving forward to finish as AIPA President, and how many friends did you lose when you decided to go and work over across the road at Cowards?
No personal friends, but all the armchair critics, right? And I mean... it
must have been pretty bruising. I mean, you're a popular president and done a very good job.
No, not really. It was a big problem for me because
Was that tap? Somebody come and said, "Wayne, will you come and work for us?" Or
Well, it was a phone call. My background is my father was a coal miner, and he spent a lot of time when I was a kid growing up on strike.
did he?
For coal mining
Yeah,
unions,
absolutely.
right? And I'd say to him, "Do you believe in this strike?" And he'd say, "No." I said, "Well, why do you go to the meeting and put your hand up?" He said, I'd get blackballed if I didn't.
Yeah,
No.
absolutely.
He said, "I'd rather not go to the meeting." Okay. So you go from there, right? And he's a dyed-in-the-wool Labor supporter. And so anyway, I stepped down from being a AIPA President. I was a 767 captain. I'd never done a pattern line as a 767 captain because I went straight from my command training into the presidency. And then about 4 days after I retired from the presidency, Roger Carmichael, who was the deputy chief pilot, effectively, rang me up and he says, "I want you to come and work for us." And I said, no, not interested. Anyway, after about the 12th or 13th time, leading over about 6 weeks, I thought about it and I thought, well, wait a sec, there's a few things that I didn't finish off or didn't achieve while I was AIPA President. This might give me a chance to finish those off. So eventually I said to him, yes, I'll come for a while and see what happens. And anyway, he said, you can't start till end of April because the board wants you to decontaminate with your union background. I said, I start in January or I don't start at all.
Well, wasn't the whole argument always you've got so much information, you need to take that with you? But here the board was telling we don't want that. We want you to come clean.
Well,
skinned.
I didn't have any secret information. No, I mean, my view in all these things, right, is Roger would have identified me over my 6 years negotiating, right?
He'd had experience watching you.
Watching and everything like that. And I would say that he and Ken Davenport, and who's the director of flight operations, and various other people, liked what they saw and decided that I could add something to their group.
I've always thought it's a compliment that the company takes ex-AIPA people because you said they've seen them operate, see how they are, see whether they're any good or not, and say, well, this person's good. Yep. Let's offer them a paid job. Yeah. Because everyone screams blue murder, says, oh, that's the worst thing, you can never... that's a different argument completely.
Well, I was never... The job that I was offered was as the deputy fleet manager for the 767.
So brand new fleet. Who was the first boss we had on the 76?
Peter Flannery.
Oh, okay, yep.
But I'd only been there about 9 months and they had a... consultants come in and they had the night of the long knives and they had to cut down the number of management pilots. And what happened was Peter left and I became the fleet manager, right? So that was okay. Peter and I are still friends. We still meet at WWII for lunch quite regularly, right? Peter never took it personally, right? And anyway, about a year later, they had another night of the long knives and they got rid of Peter Whitehall, who's probably the equivalent of Doug Alley these days, right?
I don't know.
Who was the guru on industrial stuff within flight operations.
Just stuff.
Yeah, stuff, everything, right?
Yep.
He saw all that.
Yep.
And they got rid of him, right? And a guy called Ron Cole, who was head of planning and scheduling, replaced him. And in yet another round, he left too. And no one was doing the industrial stuff. No one, right? It was just there. And stuff had ended up ending at my desk, right? And I said, by that stage, we had a new chief pilot, Ray Heiniger. And I said, you need to get someone to do this, Ray. And he said, oh, you can do it. So at that stage, I sort of by default, I took over doing all the industrial stuff for flight operations.
Because the 76 was a growing fleet, heaps of training, two pilot, all that things. That was a massive job in itself, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. And there was lots going on. In the big picture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, I did all the industrial stuff from then, which was probably about 93.
Yep.
And it wasn't until Ian Lucas became chief pilot. I was his deputy, and we went for one of these management love-ins up at the Blue Mountains, and you had to get up. We had this after dinner meeting, and you had to get up at the after dinner meeting, which included all the ground staff reps, right? And they said, go around the table. What's the greatest danger to flight operations? And they went, all the usual stuff: global warming,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when it got to me, I said, well, the greatest threat to flight operations is if I die or get run over by a bus.
Yeah, there
And
is.
they all fell off the floor laughing, right? And they say, well, why do you say that? I said, not one of you people here can take my place doing the industrial stuff. I said, you can all take my job as the fleet manager, right? Do that. I said, but there's no one. We need a ground staff guy because I'm going soon. We need a ground staff guy to come in and do that, take that off me. And it doesn't belong with a pilot anyway. It belongs with a ground staff guy. And within 6 months, we had a ground staff guy.
And a lot of that is because a sentence in a paragraph, in a sub-paragraph, in a contract that's this thick, you know where that sentence came from and what that sentence means.
Yeah.
And that's got lost, hasn't it? People are trying to change the meaning.
Yeah, they call it corporate memory or something
but they're
like
trying to change the meaning of that, that sentence. And unless it's protected, it just becomes whatever somebody at the time.
Exactly. I mean, lots of times since I've been retired, I've been contacted by people from AIPA, people from the company, people from outside the company doing legal work for both organisations. Say, look, what does this mean? Do you have the history of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I mean, when the City Tats Club was over here, that used to be one of my offices where we go and meet in the bar there and have a discussion about.
There was strategy planning. It wasn't. Yeah, it was.
Yeah. And you'd have it, say, well, here's the bits of paper, and this is what it means, and that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
So yeah.
When I joined in '96, I distinctly remember walking into the boardroom for my panel interview, and there was David Hales, and there was 3 other captains, and it was the most scariest thing I ever did in my life. I'd flown down from Horn Island. As I've told lots of people, I had to sell my car to buy my suit to come for my interview, things like that. So we were always very scared of going anywhere near QCC2, weren't we? Mahogany Row.
Yeah. Was
that a reasonable comment to make? Do you reckon should have been frightened being up there?
No, there was no reason. If I turn my mind to it, right, I can only think of 1 or 2 pilots that got sacked, and they were over misdemeanors, serious misdemeanors, right?
How many did you protect is a better way of putting it?
Oh, well, there was many, right?
Lots,
and as I say, I used to write them. I'd get a DOP, say from the schedulers or from ground staff or something, and it'd come written. So I'd write a note to the person, come and see me.
Yep. That'd go in our mailbox. We used to go up to work and sign on, and we had a key with a mailbox. You'd open it up, and thankfully I never got any of those letters, so I was pretty happy about that.
My approach was, I hope they came without representation.
Just come and have a chat.
To come and have a chat. I'd show them the DOB. I'd say, what do you got to say about that? And some would say, guilty as charged.
Yep.
Others would say, no, that's not the way it happened, right? What happened?
Yep.
And tell your version, right? Okay, then you sit down and say, was his word against theirs? And to finish that off without sort of prosecuting the matter, you'd say, well, only you know what happened. How about we close the matter on the basis that if it did happen, and I'm not saying it did, it won't happen again.
Yeah.
Happy to do it on that basis? Finished, matter closed, that's all over. That was, as far as I was concerned, a perfect result.
Did you have many frequent flyers or visitors?
A few, yeah. There was a few, probably maybe 5.
What's the strangest or the strangest explanation you had to pass up to your bosses of something, or a story that may or may not happened and got Kearnsy to cleaned up?
Well, I tried to make sure not much went up above me.
Yep.
I tried. I mean, that didn't mean I was evasive or keeping stuff hidden.
But as you said, if you could handle it, you'd handle it.
That's right.
You're paid to manage, so that's what you did.
But, there were, I always remember one case, a guy came in and he said, he was a captain, he came in and he said, I want you to take all my long service leave off me. I said, what? He said, will you take all my long service off me? I said, I can't do that. And he said, I said, why do you want that? He said, I'm going through a bit of divorce. And he said, I don't want to get half of that as well.
He was going to hide his...
He was going to... Well, he wanted to write it off.
Yeah.
He
didn't want to give it to his ex-wife.
He was prepared to forego half of it rather than go to his estranged wife. And, I mean, that was one. I remember another one. When I became joint manager for 767s in the Classic, I had to clean up a few messes, right? And one was this guy who'd been, he was actually on sick leave, but he wasn't sick. And trouble was, what had happened was a flight attendant put in a care report on him, and CASA Medical said, your medicals is suspended. And anyway, the only way he could get it back was if he went and presented to a psychiatrist and got the all clear. And he said, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not going to a psychiatrist. So he'd been off about 4 years by the time I got to handle his case. So I was aware of it, but before it was something I had to bring it to an end, right? I had to deal with it. Put him back on the roster, get him back on the roster, or finish his service with Qantas, right? Anyway, so I spoke to Ian Morrison, who spoke to CASA, and we conjured up this scheme where we're going to present a list of a dozen people, doctors in the world, who could examine him, and when they said he's okay, CASA would accept that he was okay.
Yep.
Right? And there was no doubt in my mind that he was okay.
Yep.
But he was so stubborn, he wouldn't do this, right? So anyway, I put it to the then AIPA President, who was a bit anti-company at the time. That was his attitude. And he agreed that was a good way forward. He came in with this fella, and we put it forward, and he sat where you're sitting, and he just refused to do it. He said, I'm not going to see a doctor. I said, do you realise that if you maintain that position, I'm going to have to terminate you?
This is the end of the road.
Right. You're finished, and you'll have to go and find a career somewhere else. He said, I'm not going to see a doctor. Anyway, the AIPA President turned around and he sort of dressed him down, telling him that,
listen,
he wasn't really thinking straight. Anyway, he got terminated, and because he wasn't on sick, he wasn't sick on sick leave. Basically, he'd got about 3 years' pay that he wasn't entitled to. And anyway, we had to work our way over that because he had Don Gray in his case. So,
did he? Yeah.
But anyway, we got there.
What about strange phone calls in the middle of the night?
Yes.
Some blokes
the worst one, the worst sort of thing happened was it was in an era where gay pilots stayed in the closet.
Yep.
And we had a few.
Yep.
And,
absolutely.
And what would happen was that there'd be a what I took to be a disagreement in the community, and someone that disagreed with the pilot would ring up the safety department and say, pilot such and such either takes drugs, goes to the rage parties and takes drugs, is drunk, was drunk on duty, was drinking with ours, or something like that. And it was the sort of thing that you had to take seriously, because you didn't want to wake up the next day and see it on the front page of the Daily Telegraph or on a current affair that night.
Yep.
So we probably had about maybe 5 or 6 of those. One of them, he came in and he said, "No, not me." I said, "Okay, fine." I said, "This is your first warning." And this was in the days before we had an alcohol program. And he came in. Sorry, we had the alcohol program. We didn't have
the testing.
All that now. Anyway, he came in the second time, and I said, he told him what had happened. He said, "No, definitely not me." I said, "Righto." So I said, "You're on your last warning." I said, "If we hear the next one, right, basically you'll be fighting to get your job back if you don't go on the program." And he took the warning, and then there was a third one. He came in and he said, "Well, I guess I've got to go on the program rather than be fired." I said, "Okay." So I handed him over to the Qantas Medical. And after a month or so, the head of Qantas Medical rang me up and he said, "You know that guy we put on the program?" I said, "Yeah, he hasn't got a drinking problem." I said, "Oh." I said, "You mean he's failed the program?" "No," he said, "he hasn't failed the program. He's failed the screening program to prove that he's got an alcohol problem." I said, "He's got other issues.
But it's not drinking."
But it's not drinking. I said, "Okay, right." Anyway.
Different times.
Yeah, different times. So,
how did you go about losing a flight engineer for a 2-pilot aeroplane and then pushing A pilots into a Q pilot list? I mean, we could talk about thousands of things.
When we were talking about the 767, The discussions of that started in 81, 82.
Did Ansett get theirs before or after us?
Yeah, they're the flight engineer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when all that started, the 767 was an analog aeroplane.
Okay.
The old dials,
yes,
same as the 707.
Yep.
Anyway, when Qantas came along, they said no flight engineer. And Westwood was the president, and he said, I agree with no flight engineer. The committee agreed there was no flight engineer, and the Flight Engineers Association was a separate union. And they went off and they wanted an engineer's job. And they were most upset that AIPA didn't support them. They did a world tour trying to find out why you needed a flight engineer on a 767. And came back with a report, gave it to Qantas. Qantas said, well, very good, but we're not going to have a flight engineer. Yeah. Anyway, it got resolved because Ron Yates, who was the CEO at the time, he replaced Hamilton when Hamilton had a heart attack and died very early in his life. And he was an engineer, and they did a deal with him where what they call 5N, which is the guaranteed jobs for life.
Yep. I know the guys are on that. Yep.
And when the last flight engineer went, there was only one that went to 5N, and he got so bored he eventually quit. But they had 5N, right? So we got the 767 without any flight engineer. Excuse me. When Westwood got rolled in 83, the opposition, if you like, or the alternative government, they supported the position no flight engineer as well.
Did they? Yeah.
Anyway, so then we get to the 400. And by this stage, there'd been a coup within the Flight Engineers Union, and the old guard had been rolled, and a new guard came in under Dave Heffernan, who he'd been involved in engineers' unions for years. But even though he was an older bloke, he had a very progressive outlook on life, and he and I got on very well, and we agreed that they could merge with us. That's AIPA. And he said, well, what about a flight engineer on a 747-400? I said, well, come for a ride with me and you make up your own mind. So on the 767, we used to do Sydney, Brisbane, Moresby, Brisbane, Sydney.
Yep.
So he came on that, and halfway around he said, you're right, Wayne. He said, there's no job for us here.
No, it's done.
And he said, what do you think? I said, well, I think what we should do is do a tripartite agreement with Qantas that involves engineer retraining. And I said, we'll execute a deed. We'll start off where every flight engineer will get will get an interview. They'll have a protected position on the pilot's seniority list, right? And then as they don't pass the tests, right, they'll drop off the protected position and the seniority list, right? And I think we got down to about 20 in the end, something of that order. And so the engineers themselves negotiated the conditions for that, but it was Dave and I that did the tripartite agreement and the principle.
Before we talk about when we merged with Australian, I've been handing you for a long time about a pilot list from 1920.
Yes.
How close is a list of every Qantas pilot sitting in your shed?
I would say up to the last, except for those for the last 2 years that have joined, it's about 99% complete.
I'll have to keep hounding you because I'd love to see that complete list.
Well, it's the hard bit is finding out the Christian names.
Is it?
Because all the paperwork just has initials.
JE, something or other, FC or something.
But if you hunt around, you can find what their Christian names are. And it was easy when I was in the office, right? But not being in the office, it's a lot of hunting around. So it's just needs that last bit. Yeah.
I won't let you rest on that
one. No, it's there. It's there. Yeah.
So we had a fair bit of history with the AFAP. Then Qantas decides to merge with Australian Airlines.
Yes.
So that's two separate airlines and two separate unions again. The battle starts all again.
Well, again, Ken Davenport was the chief pilot, and he gave me the job. He said, I'll give you the job of putting the flight operations departments together.
Had it been successfully done anywhere? Like, does like the Americans or the Europeans?
In the management it had, but everywhere, including New Zealand, where two airlines merged, there was always a fight that lots of times, especially in the States, went into legal action, right? Yep. And in New Zealand was the same story when they merged Air New Zealand and NAC.
Yep.
So I thought, well, we want to avoid that. So I thought about it, and I'd already been thinking about it, about the why, and the issue that we had was a lot of the people that worked for the old Australian Airlines, apart from 12, they were people that had come back.
They're pretty new joiners of Australia.
And the rest were just people who just came from all over the place, right? And basically they wanted a datal seniority system. Yeah. Well, I was determined that wasn't going to happen, right? So I had to come. So I decided that the best way to do it was that former Australian Airlines aircraft are protected for them. Qantas aircraft are protected for them, and then they come together at the date of joining, and then either side has rights on the other side to go all the way down.
Yep.
And then we put the Y together. It was funny as a circus, dealing after the dispute and the airline started up again. The Australian pilots were on a common law contract, which became an award. It was about a 6-page award.
Well, they traded everything for cash, didn't they, basically?
No, they weren't in a position of trade. I asked Ian Olmedo years later why they gave them so much money. Mm. And he said, well, we had to attract people. He was working for Ansett. And he said, we had to attract people back. So he said, they had so many little bits and pieces. He said, we added up all the money stuff, right? And we put that together, and then we came up with a sum, and we said, that's their salary, right? So they get their salary, and for their salary, they it was like the long haul minimum guarantee.
Yep.
And anything they do over that is an incentive.
They got a premium.
And there's no patent protection or anything like that.
Yep.
And he said that's how we ended up with the figure. And he said, but the difference was before it was the maximum they got, and this was the minimum they got.
So it underwrote what they.
Yeah, and that's why the short haul EBA had zero conditions in it, and here we are, 30 years later, and the last thing they've just voted and approved on
has been conditions.
More conditions.
Absolutely,
yeah.
It's so important.
So anyway, we had that, but the union representative, they were agency clients for the ASU, which is the ASU are the check-in people.
Yes,
the people do the flight planning, the scheduling, and all that sort of stuff, right? And they've always had ambitions for pilots, and so they TA recruited, or TA and Ansett recruited this guy called Eric Green, who worked for Qantas for a short time, to be the liaison bloke, and trying to negotiate the integration agreement was you go to a meeting and there'd be 6 Australian Airlines pilots. You get to a position where you thought you had an agreement, and then next meeting you went to be different 6 because they decided, because they didn't have any structure, because they decided they didn't like what the agreement was. And then eventually we got to it where the Americans, the ex-Braniff people, took it over, and they were nearly all A300 people, and they wanted it all changed so that the A300 people got lots of protections, and they didn't care so much about the 737, so it was a matter of keeping it on. And anyway, when we eventually, I went off with some mates of mine on a men behaving badly to where we did a pub crawl from Sydney to Darwin.
But that would have been for research purposes or something.
Yeah,
important.
Yeah. So, well, everything. The agreement was done and was waiting to be written up.
I spoke to Andrew Marshall on a previous podcast about, is everything for sale? We had a chat about that. He said, no, everything's not for sale, but some things, if you come and offer me the right price, I'll consider selling it.
That's right.
So that's what you're saying there,
Well, you just got to, my view is just got to keep an open mind on everything and have a very good idea of the value to you of what you've got, and the value to them of what they want. And then some things you might say, well, the price is never going to be high enough.
Yeah.
And so we're not going to do
Yeah.
that. Right.
So I guess what should have I listened to you when on my induction when I turned up and all the senior captains come in 96 and spoke to me? What should have I listened to that you told me then? And then now what you're going to tell me something that I need to listen to going forward?
Well, in those, I forget whether it was those days, but I think it was the days where you'd give the official stuff, right? And then I'd say, righto, now I want you to write your superannuation down on a bit of paper and then tear it in half and then in half again. And then have a look at the value of one of the little bits of paper. And if you don't look after your marriage, that'll be what your superannuation is going to be worth. And I think that's pretty spot on.
So now in the last 10 years of my career, give me another piece of advice that I will take this time going forward for the next 30 years.
Don't invest badly.
Did you listen to mates saying, come on, Kearnsy, we've got to get into this? Never?
No, never.
No ostriches, no tea tree?
No, I dodged all those lurks. And to be fair, most of my mates did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you'd be like sort of skid that and you'd skid this and miss that and everything like that. And I dodged all that because I couldn't see the value in putting everything at risk just because you're going to get a tax advantage. And it was the wrong reason for investing. But people would say, oh, I'm a pilot, but, I know everything about everything, right? So that looks a good deal. I'll put some money in there.
Yep.
And lots of them got their fingers burnt.
Yep. And retirement filled with lots of travel?
Oh, yeah. Well, I just retired, hadn't been retired for long, and AIPA rang me up and said, how would you like to come work for us as a consultant?
I'll ask you that again. How would you like to come work for us for a consultant?
Well, if I could be helpful, right? But come along and work for us as a consultant. I said, I hadn't thought about that. Let me think about it. And I thought, I really need to tell Peter Wilson I've got this offer, because if I take the offer, I wouldn't want the first time he sees me when I'm opposite on the other side of the table.
Absolutely.
So I need to tell him and tell him that I'm considering it seriously. And anyway, so I rang him and he said, oh, are you? I said, yeah. He said, I didn't think you'd do that. I said, well, I didn't either. I said, but, And he said, will you come and work for us? I said, oh. So I had two offers, right? So I thought about it for a while. And in the end, I formed the view that the incumbent government of AIPA probably wouldn't take my advice on an industrial approach. And the lockout of 2011 proved that. And so I went and went for a consultant with Wilson. I worked for Peter Wilson. And initially it was for a year, but because of all the drawn out stuff that went on until the CWD, it turned out to be 3 years. So anyway, I gave that up. I took over as chairman of the owners corporation, the block of units that we've got living in Killara. I didn't want that job either, but the two incumbents were useless. And then someone said to me, we're going to get rid of them. And I said, well, someone else will do it. And they said, no, it's either them or you. And right. So
here's another one of these
so
jobs.
I'm still there, 16, 17 years later. And then I was always interested in the Retired Pilots Association. I promised Norm Field that I'd keep it going when he couldn't do it anymore. He was the chairman and he died in harness, so I took over. Well, that's been 3 or 4 years now. And we have a lunch, get about 40, 50 people along 4 times a year, which is good. So that's good. We do my wife and I do a lot of travel. We've got a place up on the Central Coast that's we've had for 30 years. We usually go up there Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Got 3 grandkids.
Plenty.
Yeah.
So what's really obvious is we've run out of time and I haven't even started to scratch the surface with Wayne. So listeners, I promise, Wayne, will you come back? Can we do this again?
Yeah.
So we're going to an undertaking. So we'll be back. So please stay tuned for part 2 of my fantastic chat with Captain Wayne Kearns, retired. Wayne, thank you very much. And again, thank you everyone for listening, and stick with it.